Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. And I thought I'd get into a little talk about swords. More specifically, the sword arms that an anime character known as Hyakimaru has in the anime Dororo. Now, you might find this interesting that, and I'll be getting to that in a minute, but I have to give you a brief history of the show. If any of you have seen the new anime Dororo, it's actually based off of a 1950s, it's actually a remake of a 1950s anime called Dororo and Hyakimaru, who was in turn made after a manga was written, and the premise of Hyakimaru is that when he was born, his father, Daigo Ketetsumasu, I forget his father's name, but Daigo, I think is his last name. Daigo, he made a pact with 48 demons in the original anime and manga. That if the demons gave him the power to rule his lands, then he would give them the body of his newborn son. Well, something went wrong, and in the original, I think the demons did get all 48 body parts, and Hyakimaru, that's his name, is not given to him by his father, because as soon as Hyakimaru is born, the demons take his body parts, and he is then sent down a river where he meets a doctor who can make prosthetic limbs. And this doctor, he makes the prosthetic limbs for Hyakimaru and basically raises him as his own son. This is all in the original. And then a time skip happens of at least 20 years. Hyakimaru is full grown by now. He meets a young kid named Dororo, who I believe this is the same as in the original and in the new one, that we think he's a boy at first, but he's actually a girl raised as a boy. But in any case, Dororo, Dororo starts to call Hyakimaru Oni-chan, or brother. And the two start to go off and get Hyakimaru's body parts back. In the 2018 remake of Hyakimaru, 2018-2019, it follows the same story. Hyakimaru is sacrificed. He's given the name by the prosthetic limb maker. He meets Dororo, and they go off on their adventure together, getting Hyakimaru's body parts back. Now, I heard this once, that the reason they switched... Now, in the new one, he actually fights 12 demons, not 48. And this is mostly because of the fact that I think it was to emphasize the importance of Hyakimaru getting his body back. But in any case, with that in mind, that's Hyakimaru's backstory. And the word, I think Hyakimaru, if I understood the translation in the anime correctly, it means 100 demon sword. It means like 100 demon killer or 100 demon sword, which is a very fitting name for Hyakimaru. But due to the fact that he has prosthetic limbs, he has swords in his arms, and those were given to him by the doctor, which I do not remember his name, so forgive me. But he was given the arms by the doctor. Actually had swords from his younger days when he served as a combatant. So when Hyakimaru went off on his journey, he took the swords and he placed them in Hyakimaru's arms over his hands. Now, don't ask me how he's able to use his fingers and shit. It's anime logic. I'd assume that a special form of wood carving was involved, or maybe Hyakimaru's will is just that strong. I don't really understand how he's able to do it, but he can do it. Okay? When Hyakimaru gets into a fight, he pulls his fake arms off, which is like the scabbards to the swords, and then he uses the swords like so, with slashing motions. Now, that's what I wanted to talk about, the efficiencies, the pros and cons of having sword arms instead of using a normal sword. And I'm going to start off with the sword arms first. Okay, now pretend my arms were blades. We're pretending my arms are blades. Now, Hyakimaru, he uses his sword arms pretty simply. He thrusts, he slashes, and he blocks, and such and so like that. And he obviously cuts with these things too. But the pros of this, I always want to start with the pros first because I think the cons outweigh the pros. So, with that in mind, Yakimaru's sword arms. I'm going to use my right arm for an example. Well, they're good. I mean, I can see the pros of these weapons. I mean, you never lose them. You can't lose these weapons unless your whole arm is destroyed. You always have a way of fighting, even if you are disarmed. No pun intended. And, if I miss any of these pros, or you think of any pros or cons that I should add them in the comment section. But another pro I would think would be the sheer fact that if you were to block with the swords, you'd have the added advantage. Well, normally, Yakimaru's entire arms are prosthetics. But he does eventually, I think, get his muscular structure back. His body is weird, and I don't exactly know the anatomy of how he fights. But usually, you would be able, whenever you see a kickboxer, for example, block with his arm, he's not only using his arm to block, but he's using the mechanical advantage of having his arm and his socket also absorbing the blow. And a pivoting point on his elbow. Although sometimes you see them block like this, and that's also to give mechanical advantage. This is a very strong mechanical advantage because you can relieve the pressure simply by moving your arm. And since your arm doesn't tend to bend in this direction, it actually makes sense to block like that. But as I said, that would also explain why Hyakimaru blocks the way he does. His fighting style is very reminiscent on these, and he uses them as his main weapons most of the time. But with that in mind, I think I've covered the con. I think I've covered the pros fairly well. And again, he has solid defense because he has mechanical advantage from his upper arm. Now the cons that I would see happening with swords in your arms. First of all, reach. Okay, the human arm is relatively only about 2 feet long from shoulder to tip of your hand. And I really don't. And Yakimaru's blades, actually, the tang. We'll pretend my comb is the tang. The tang actually extends outwards from his what would be elbow joint. So the habaki, which is the color of the sword, and a good portion of the sword, his blades usually only start from my thumb onwards this way. And that actually cuts his blade length down a severe amount. Because in a fight, when you're using swords, you want every bit of reach and leverage you can get out of the sword. So, using two shorter swords, there are actually sword styles that utilize this. Sword and dagger, for example, uses like a rapier and a fencing or parrying dagger, which basically is like a European sai to parry away your opponent's blade and strike with yours. But with that in mind, the reach that Hyakimaru has isn't all that great, and he has to get in closer in order to be effective in battle. So reach is a major con in this category. And I want you to know, Hyakimaru actually has a sword on his hip, and that's what I'm going to get to later. But yeah, the reach is a severe con in my opinion. Because if I'm standing here, and my opponent is standing here, uh, use this. Let's pretend the black of my sword. Let's pretend the grip of my sword is an opponent. And I'm standing over here with my sword arm. Now, I'd actually have to either extend my back and reach forward, which could throw me off balance and give my opponent the added advantage, or I'd have to get closer. I definitely would have to get closer in order to make the cut. And that gives my opponent advantage because I have to be closer to them. And if they have a longer weapon, not only do they have the advantage of having the longer weapon, which will keep me at bay. I mean, I'm pretending to be Hakimaru. I'm Hyakimaru in this instance, which would give them the ability to keep me away. But also, they'd have another advantage knowing that my weapons are shorter and smaller, which means I can't generate as much leverage and power, which I'll get into in a minute. But with that in mind, I'm farther away, and I can't cut as effectively. I can't get close to them. Because if my opponent is right here, like in this example, you are the opponent, and I'm all the way back here. I can't possibly reach you. See if I can get this into a better. I can't possibly reach you with just my arm, but I'd have to get a lot closer, which means I'm now in this your blade's striking area. If you have a longer weapon, so reach is a very important con in this. Now, Hyakimaru, generally he fights opponents that aren't armed with swords and weapons. So, reach is not that big of an issue with that, but you still have to get in closer with a shorter weapon. Next, leverage and power. This is where I mentioned this before. Hyakimaru does have good mechanical advantage, just not with cutting. Blocking his swords would be extremely proficient at because of the mechanical advantages he gets from his body, from the joints of his body. Because as I said, kickboxers are able to block with their forearm without too much hassle because it's mechanically sound. You have your whole forearm blocking the opponent's strike. And then you also have the added advantage of a your upper arm also absorbing some shock. So that will allow you to block your opponent's attack. Hyakimaru, an example, blocking would be a very good pro. He'd be very efficient at blocking because of that mechanical advantage. However, cutting and such is something different. Hyakimaru's sword techniques mainly involve thrusting, and the reason why is his sword arms are very effective are very suited for thrusting, really, because just like a punch, when you throw a punch, you're putting not only your body weight behind the punch, but since your arm is straight, you're getting the full mechanical advantage of your knuckles, your wrist, your arm, your elbow, your upper arm, and your shoulder, all working in tandem. Same with a thrust, because when you thrust, it's basically like throwing a punch with a sword. You're getting that added advantage of the wrist, the lower arm, the elbow, the upper arm, and the shoulder, all working in tandem to perform the thrust. Hyakimaru's sword of fighting style is very good at thrusting because he gets that same mechanical advantage. However, cutting is a different story. Cutting requires leverage. where in the cut, sorry, that was my speaker, you're basically doing this. See? You are cutting. You're using your shoulder, your upper, lower elbow, your upper and lower arms, your elbow, and your wrist, all to perform a cut. Not to mention, you'll also be twisting your hips when you perform the cut and stepping forward. So you're putting your whole body into the cut. And when you cut with the top part of the blade right here, the point of percussion. And as you can see, it's very much like a lever, very much like a fulcrum. Your hand is like a fulcrum, generating power. Now, when you swing a sword, the tip of the sword will always swing faster than the bottom. And the faster the cutting part of your sword swings, the more effective your cut will be. That's why in a lot of, if you ever watch cutting videos on YouTube, they swing two-handed to double the cut and double the control. Because when you use two hands on a blade, you double the power and you double the control of the sword. Hyakimaru doesn't have that ability. His sword arms are connected to his weapons, his sword arms, don't have really that ability. I mean, yeah, you can generate power like this. Like, sword arm again. Yeah, you can generate power like this. But it won't be as effective as this. And that's simply because of the fact that not only are you... Length equals leverage, okay, people? The longer your blade, the more leverage and power you have in the cut. Again, going back to how short Hyakimaru's sword arms are, that would not give him a lot of leverage in the cut. So speed and leverage are a big issue for him. Now, again, I said he'd be efficient at blocking and very good at thrusting. But with the size of his opponents, just thrusting won't be enough. He actually has to cut. Now, he would be able to throw an effective shoulder cut. That I could see him doing. Where a shoulder cut is basically like you stand like so, and you're using the shoulder and the back mostly to power the cut. And I could see him doing that. I mean, he does do that. And he also cuts and then runs with the cut. And what I mean by that is he stabs his opponent and then just pushes through. Now, again, this is anime, so he has incredible strength. But in the real world, you won't easily be able to do that. It is feasible. It is doable. But... not with your left hand. If your opponent is standing here and you use your left hand, it won't be as doable because all that force will be pushing back on your arms, and you'd have to exert even more force in order to counter it, and you could actually end up tearing your arm up. You want to do it with your right arm sword. You want to do it with his right arm like that, because that way you are pushing rather than pulling. Pushing, actually, you will always get more force with pushing than you will with pulling. But in any case, with that in mind, that's another con. Leverage and power. Two big cons when you're a swordsman. And another con of his sword arms, I would guess, I'd really have to say sword arms in general. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, we've seen arm-based weapons work. Shredder from TMNT, Predator, like the wrist blades, but those are all swords that are on the outside of the arms. These are actual swords that are, once you take the prosthetic arm off, you have a sword blade. And I really imagine Hyakimaru's sword blades. Um, First of all, I don't really the way they're attached to his arm. Now, granted, uh, they look to be encased in the newer version. They look to be encased in some sort of iron or heavily glued in place or something like that. Maybe it's the Suba and it's fitted to the arm in a certain way, but the tang, another con would be the tang coming out of the elbow joint. And the reason I say that's a con is because that's part of the sword that can rust. And if it rusts enough, that rust can actually get underneath your wooden arm and get into the blade and cause it to break from the inside out. And maintenance is another thing. With a properly fitted saya, the type of scabbard the katana has, when you hear that click sound when the sword has been placed all the way inside the saya, that actually says that the saya is a good fit and will actually create a watertight seal that will keep the water and moisture out away from the blade and keep it safe. In this case, Hyakimaru, I really don't see that. I don't see his prosthetic arms being able to do that. And I've seen his prosthetic arms, and they look just to be huge hollowed out tubes. Now, if they were specifically fit to the sword, like the inside was thick and wooden, and there was only a little groove inside for the sword to rest in, I'd be fine with that. Because it would be more like a saya. His is more like just big tube put on sword. And rust and stuff can easily accumulate on that sword unless he oils it periodically, or Dororo oils his sword blades. Of course, this is anime, so unless they write it in the script that the swords had rusted out, they won't rust out. But in the real world, you'd have to oil the sword blade every once in a while, unless the scabbard was properly designed and properly constructed so that water wouldn't get in there as often. But with that in mind, that's another con, maintenance. His sword arms would require a lot of maintenance. And also, another con of his sword arms. I'm sorry, I love Hyakimaru as a character. I love the underdog stories. And I love romance stories, believe it or not. I'm a huge fan of guy gets the girl in the end, lives happily ever after. Don't judge me. I'm an otaku. But in any case, I'm a nerd, geek, otaku. I'm basically like a hillbilly smorgasbord of geekdom and nerddom. But in any case, with that in mind, Hyakimaru's sword arms, I foresee another big... I need to address the elephant in the room as I see it. Well, me seeing the elephant in the room, and that's what will happen when he does get his arms back. I realize these arms are prosthetic, but what will happen when he gets his arms back? Will he return the swords to his adoptive father, or will he give the swords to Dororo, or what? And I feel like that's an elephant in the room, because when he got his leg back in one of the episodes, he got his leg back, then he lost it, then he got it back again. It's a complex episode. I think it was like episode 10 or some shit. But in any case, when he got his leg back, his prosthetic one fell off and the new one grew out. So, with that in mind, I would think that his prosthetic arms would fall off and his old arms would actually grow in. Or maybe it's Maybe something like that, but that's just an elephant in the room I felt needed to be addressed. Where his prosthetic arms would probably fall off or some shit. But in any case, with that in mind, another con of these weapons are just how do you use them efficiently? Because you really have to make your own sword style to go along with these weapons. And for the simple fact, for the simple fact that if these swords would break, the swords have actually broken in the anime, and he got them repaired. But what if if the swords would break, you'd have to actually pull them out from your arms and everything, have them fixed, then have them reinstalled, and then I would feel like that would be very much a time-consuming chore. And for the simple fact that, also, what if his hands were to be broken? The sheaths of his hands, give it as, or so to speak. Because again, his hands are prosthetic and they're wooden. What if they were to be broken? His swords would not be able to be returned to a scabbard-like holster, and he would just permanently have sword blades always sticking out. That would be a problem that I would see Hyakkimaru being forced to deal with. Unless he went back to the prosthetic doctor. Unless he went back to his doctor father and he's like, okay, Dad, I need you to remake me arms because I broke mine. But yeah, those are the cons I see. So Hyakimaru's sword arms in general. It's conclusion time for that. I feel like Hyakimaru's sword arms, they're good weapons if you know how to use them. And Hyakimaru does know how to use them. I don't think I could be able to use sword arms efficiently like he could. But for the simple fact that he knows how to use his sword arms and he knows how to employ them, I do see Hyakimaru being able to fight on equal terms with anyone in his anime. But in the real world, Hyakimaru's sword arms were facing real-world problems that swordsmen had to face in history. Maintenance, care, rust, usability. They just wouldn't work out as well. Like, I love Hyakimaru as an anime. I have watched every single episode so far. But in any case, well, that's not true. I started watching the 1950s anime on YouTube, and then I got into another anime, and then I was like, I completely forgot about it. So I'm going back to I'm rewatching that one. Okay, but I watched the 1950s anime before I watched the remake, and I love both of them. I'm more partial to the 1950s anime, just even though it's not as fluent as the new one. I like the old one better because it was more faithful to the few chapters of the manga I actually read. But in any case, with that in mind, what if I don't think Hyakimaru's sword arms will work? What do I think would be a good weapon for him? Well, to use the sword on his belt. And you're probably wondering, oh, Hyakimaru, he's famous for using his sword arms. Why would he, just listen, why would he choose to abandon them for a normal sword? Listen. Okay, so you heard me explain all this. The sword arms have a lot of cons, and I'm using real-world logic to explain this. They have a lot of cons that the anime doesn't explain. However, real swords are much more versatile. And another con I forgot to mention is Hyakimaru is very limited in how he can use his swords. Because, again, he can only basically slash in these directions. He's limited to very straight, angular slashes because of how he has no wrist. The wrist in swordsmanship is a crucial part of the body that allows you to switch in between techniques. Yakimaru's he doesn't have a wrist when he uses his arm blades. However, this, his sword, does. Because, as you can see, I can twirl this sword much better than I can do this. I have to use my whole arm to do this. With this, I can just twirl my wrist and move the blade in any direction that I see fit to move it in. I can even go for a thrust this way and then quickly change it to an upward block like so. And that's because swords are much more versatile. I would think that if he used the sword on his hip, he'd get a lot more versatility out of it and he'd be able to fight a lot more efficiently. He'd actually be a lot deadlier because with all that power that he uses to perform the cuts with his sword arms, he could perform even more powerful cuts if he was to use just a normal sword. Because, again, as I said earlier, this is not as powerful as this. And with that in mind, the pros of using a sword. First of all, of a normal sword. First of all, reach. You can keep your opponent farther away from you than if you were just using your hands. If you see here, my sword blade is a lot longer than my arm. So I can keep you at a farther distance, keeping me safe and not letting you hit me. But in any case, and not to say that blocking with a sword, blocking with a cutting, because I'd be able to perform a lot more powerful cuts with a two-handed sword rather than my sword arm. I'd get a lot more leverage, a lot more power, and a lot more control out of using a sword like this than if I was using sword arm. And with that in mind, Yakimaru's sword, I like the design of it, and I think that if he would utilize that a little more, he'd be much more proficient, and eventually he's going to have to utilize this more when he gets his arms back. Now, not to say he doesn't know how to use it, he does use it in his fight against his brother Tohamaru. But in any case, with that in mind, of course, you still have the cons of a normal sword. Maintenance, rust. Of course, there's also weight. Because Yakimaru's arms are prosthetics, he doesn't really feel the weight of his sword arms as much as he would feel the weight of a real sword. So an actual sword might be a little more tiring if you don't have the prosthetic arms to use it. And eventually you will feel the weight of a sword. It's inevitable that with organic arms, you will start to fatigue yourself using a normal sword. Your arms will feel the fatigue, your whole body will feel it. But in any case, with that in mind, yes, I still think that if he were to use a normal sword, he would be much more proficient in battle than if he was to use something else. If he was to keep using his sword arms. And with that in mind, you also have the added use of a normal sword to where if you had to, you could abandon the two-handed grip and use it one-handed. And I know all of you out there is like, you can't use a two-handed sword one-handed. What are you talking about? It's sword snobs. Remember, I told you just go the fuck away if you're a sword snob. Just stop watching this video now. If you have to criticize everything, in my opinions, to the point of insulting me, just go the fuck away. I don't want to hear it. But in any case, with that in mind, yes, you can actually use a two-handed sword one-handed. Not in a lot of ways, But yeah. So if he had to, he could switch from the two-handed grip to like a one-handed thrust, or he could. In actuality, if Hyakkimaru would abandon his sword arms, he could even dual wield normal swords. Of course, dual wielding also you face a lot of fatigue. But he could actually dual wield normal swords. And with his strength, he could actually do some pretty devastating, pretty much a lot of devastating shit. And it would be good for fighting multiple opponents. Now, I guess his sword arms would work for that as well, considering the fact that he'd be able to block one strike from coming from this way and another strike coming directly at him. Just do like this. Like block here, and it's like done. But I really do feel like he would get a lot more advantage out of using a normal sword, because with a normal sword, you can use techniques and stuff that you can't use with this arm. Sure, it has the cons of it's more tiring, and you're probably going to go through a little more maintenance. Well, not a little more maintenance, but it's more tiring, it's more physically demanding. It'd probably take a little more skill to use a real sword versus the arm swords. But the cons of a real sword outweigh them in this case, because in swordsmanship, even the slightest little twist of your wrist or repositioning of your arm can win you the whole duel. So it's not that Hyakimaru's sword arms, they're not bad weapons. It's just that a normal sword has more versatility than a sword arm. Because if my opponent is striking at me like this, and I only have sword arm, then I can only do a set number of things. With a normal sword, sure, I can still only do a set number, but that number is a little higher. So if he's coming at me with a downward slash like this, I could block his slash with my sword in one hand, and then give it a little push to break out the bind. Or if I wanted to, I could even push up and pull down like this. And this is more of a use for if your sword has a cross guard like European works, like an upswept cross guard like in European swords. I could push his sword up, sliding it down mine, and then lock it into place with my cross guard. Then manipulate his sword downwards and go in for a thrust. Or something like that. Or I could also just sidestep, hold my blade up like this, let the sword run down the side, do another sidestep, and slash like so. So, using proper technique, you can actually get a lot more versatile attacks out of a sword than you could using arm swords. Granted, you'd probably be able to do the same thing, where it's like this, block, sidestep, and cut. But you'd be able to do the same thing. It's just you'll get a lot more leverage and power. And in a sword fight, he who has the stronger, faster sword usually wins. The one with more, because strength does matter in a sword fight. If you are physically stronger than your opponent, then you do have an advantage over him. And if you combine that strength with good technique and speed, you're incredibly hard to defeat. Because the stronger you are, the longer you're going to be able to hold your sword without being tired. The weaker you are, the less time you're going to be able to hold your sword without getting tired. And in this case, Hyakimaru, being that he has prosthetic arms, his arms aren't going to physically feel the weight of that sword. So he's actually going to be able to use that sword for a long, long time before he starts having to put it down. Before he even, I would think, feels the fatigue of using it. But with that in mind, Yakimaru's sword arms, again, I keep saying that they are good weapons if you know how to use them. But a normal sword can do a lot more damage and be a lot more functional. So, with that in mind, how would I sum up everything I've just talked about? Yakimaru's sword arms. Good weapons, good defensive weapons, and if you know how to use them efficiently, they're very good. However, if you're going up against somebody with a normal sword, and they're at the same skill level as you, let's say, for example, Yakimaru and this other guy, they both have equal skill. They're complete equals. Except this guy uses a normal sword, and he uses his sword arms. Now, it will really all depend on, if you're equal with somebody, it depends on skill, technique, and timing. But with that in mind, I really do feel like Yakimaru's sword arms are good weapons. The way I would utilize them more is
quit yelling.
Go away. With thrusting, go away.
Do what you're told.
With thrusting, sorry, my uncle's being a fool. But in any case, with that in mind, I would really utilize them more with thrusting techniques, similar to rapier style fighting, but I would really utilize them with thrusts and like up close cuts, like draw cuts across the belly where the blade is touching the opponent's skin, and then you just push and draw. And that's how I would utilize his arm blades. If I had a choice between using his arm blades and a normal sword, I would use a normal sword, because that way not only do I get the ability to thrust and the ability to perform powerful cuts, but I can also block, parry, and strike with a lot more proficiency than if I was just using my arm blades. But yes, that's what I would do. So in conclusion, I do believe Yakimaru's arm blades are good. They're good weapons. They're badass to see in a fight. And if you have the skill and the ability to use them, then they would be very useful. However, if I had to lean towards it, if I had to give it my personal opinion, I believe a sword would be a better all-around weapon to use. A normal sword like this, of course this is a boken, but you get the point. A normal sword like this, because you have the versatility, you have a lot more versatility with this sword. And the more things you can do in a fight, the better. So, if Hyakimaru starts to utilize his normal sword a lot more, I believe he would be an even more effective combatant in a battle. But those were just my personal thoughts on Yakimaru and his sword arms. If you like this video, share it and stuff. If you don't have to. I'm not about to say, hit the hell of that like button and shit, because you like it, you like it, you don't. It's just that. So, until next time, although I will ask you to, if you like this, at least subscribe. I will ask you to do that. And leave your comments below. So, until next time, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all, be crazy rednecks and be safe when using your weapons. I'm out. Peace.